I hope everyone had a chance to see Boycott. If not, please, this isn't too late. Go watch the film. It's a really good one. Um, but I hope our conversation today will help unpack some of the themes that came up during it for us that we wanted to share with you all, and then open up some space for you all to process what the takeaways are as well. Really excited to have Sharon and David joining us today. I don't think they've hopped on a Learning Core call yet. They're two of my excellent colleagues, both technically in the DC office with me, although David's currently, as he mentioned, in Israel, Palestine. And I'm really excited to have the three of us here having this conversation with you all. We, as you know, one of our principles and practices is centering the leadership of the marginalized. So when we have conversations about Israel, Palestine, we always want to be including Israeli, Jewish, Palestinian voices. But for this conversation, I think it is appropriate that we've got, three of the folks from the DC team to talk about why this is also a deeply American issue, and for our Canadian friends, domestic issue more broadly. So really grateful that they took the time to join us today, and excited to have you guys have the chance to chat with them too. So why we wanted to dive into anti-boycott legislation using the film Boycott, but also more broadly, is Israel-Palestine might feel far away. It might feel like a foreign policy issue that doesn't touch us on a daily basis. But as we know at Telos, it's one that we've imported into our domestic politics in a way that means it touches all of us, even if we're not engaged in the Israel-Palestine space. And this has real ramifications for us as Americans, both within the context of being peace builders or peacemakers in Israel-Palestine, but also just for other issues we carry about wholly unconnected to Israel-Palestine when it comes to our free speech and ability to advocate for, deeply held values and beliefs. So our hope for the conversation today is to spend some time unpacking why this anti-boycott legislation is problematic on multiple levels, why preserving effective tools for political advocacy and nonviolent resistance is critical for us as peacemakers, to listen to understand more about what the BDS movement is and the role boycotts have played in our own civil rights history, and then also, if that wasn't ambitious enough, to touch on why we need to continue to address anti-Semitism in its various forms in conjunction with this other work we're talking about. Doing this hand in hand with advocating for Israeli-Palestinian rights against anti-Semitism. I think Greg talked about that on a previous call. It's a theme that will continue to come up, but these aren't separate conversations. This is something that always has to happen together with all of our other peacemaking advocacy. So to dive in, I'm just going to quickly summarize what we learned in Boycott, and then I want to spend some time looking through the anti-BDS legislation or anti-boycott legislation trackers that Just Vision and Palestine Legal have put out. We'll drop some links in the chat for you all to see those as well, but I think they do a really good job showing visibly what this looks like and how it's spread over time. But just in case you didn't see Boycott, 34 states currently have laws on the books that penalize individuals or companies that use boycotts or other nonviolent measures aimed at pressuring Israel on its human rights record in violation of Palestinian rights. This looks different in different cases. I am not a lawyer. I know we've got some on the call today, but the penalties can look different. Refusal to invest state funds or pensions in companies that won't pledge not to boycott Israel, conditioning contracts like we saw in the film on pledging not to boycott Israel, refusing to give government money to individuals or state contractors who refuse not to boycott Israel. Those are all some of the many different ways these laws can take shape and take form. And one really important distinction here is it's not just penalizing people who actively choose to boycott, it's requiring that people say or commit to that they will not boycott. And that's where it becomes a free speech issue. It's making a decision for folks politically without letting them make up their own minds on whether or not, if and how they want to engage on these issues. Those are oftentimes the state laws. There's also parallel efforts at the federal government level to adopt legislation that prohibits American citizens from boycotting companies that profit from Israel's violation of human rights in international law. Two of kind of the common examples, and again, this is what we really want to focus on today, but I think are helpful to illustrate, are formerly SodaStream, the fizzy drink company, manufactured their products in settlements in the West Bank, which are illegal under international law. And Sabra Hummus is another big example that made their products in settlements in the West Bank, which is illegal under international law. And so the legislation there would be prohibiting or targeting individuals who said, I'm not going to buy Sabra Hummus because it goes against my values to buy something that was made in a settlement. And so, yeah, there's a lot more to unpack. As I said, I'm not a legal scholar, so I really would encourage you to check out these two websites. and want to turn into a little bit of an exploration of them. If you'll give me a sec, I can share my screen. I am realizing I haven't shared my screen before on this computer, so it's asking me to enable permissions. David, how do you feel about sharing your screen?
Yeah, give me one moment and I can get those pulled up.
Okay, I'll put the link in the chat.
Great.
Sorry,
That would
folks.
be helpful. Okay. Let's do this. All right, can you all see this?
Yes.
Okay, let's go to the states map. And Sarah, why don't you direct me from here?
Yeah, that's perfect. So I actually want to go down and have you start by playing the little time lapse that shows the change from 2014 to today, and just watch and see how these laws have spread over time. So a couple points to tease out here. One, you see the key down on the right-hand side. These maps show a combination of legislation that's in effect, that's been defeated, that was struck down in court, that's pending. I think it's really important to notice that as this legislation has spread, right from the beginning, there have been folks challenging it both in the courts and in state legislatures to try and keep it from spreading. The other really important thing to see is as these laws take effect, they build momentum. And as they mentioned in the film, once a law is in place in one state, it's easier to enact the same or similar laws in other states, especially with legislation templates. So that's partly why it's really important to build momentum to also try and counter these. So it's much harder to defeat or strike down a law once it's in place than it is to defeat it from passing in the first place. David, can you go to a sec? Can you go to the statistics page for a sec? So again, I'm a visual learner as well as an auditory or reading learner. And so that's why I'd encourage you to poke around on here on your own as well. It's interesting to see how many bills have been introduced versus passed. And to me, that's concerning because it shows that there's a real movement that wants to push these through in addition to all the ones we already see on the books. And if you look at the bar graph at the bottom, I also really want to point out that when the green comes in, those are those other laws that the movie gives the examples of relating to climate change or the firearm industry, other laws that are modeled off of these anti-boycott legislation bills that take the same template but switch up what you're not allowed to boycott. So as we see these trends over time, the anti-boycott laws are concerning enough in and of themselves, but then you also see the introduction of those other themes and topics that are using the same legislation that's really targeting them.
Sarah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
The anti-Semitism redefinition legislation.
Yes.
Would that mostly be legislation that redefines anti-Semitism as anti-Zionist, or like what is that typically looking like?
That's a great question. Thanks for bringing that up now. We're going to dive in a little bit deeper later, but yeah, that would be legislation that typically defines anti-Semitism to include criticizing the state of Israel, not distinguishing between if you're critiquing Israel as a Jewish state versus critiquing specific Israeli policy. We'll touch on that a little bit more later. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but that's another kind of concerning element of this, where any legitimate critique of the state of Israel gets labeled as anti-Semitism. What we're doing today, unpacking nuance, talking about human rights for everyone, that starts to like get labeled as potentially anti-Semitism where we know it's not. And we'll unpack that more later. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but that's a great question, Virginia. Thanks for asking. David, do you want to briefly just open the Just Vision one as well that I'm putting in the chat now?
Absolutely. And folks, I would definitely recommend that you click on these links and bookmark them and spend some time exploring them. And at least the Palestine legal one, I know is regularly updated, like almost to the day sometimes. So if you want any, up-to-date information about where these laws are in the process, you should definitely use these resources.
Yeah, and I'll send the links out after this call with the recording as well. On this one, David, if you want to just scroll down. This is another one, and just pause there. Oh, okay. When I looked at it, it was one from like March of 2023. That was the most recent one to be passed. So as you scroll through and poke around here, I'd encourage you to check out your state's legislation, especially because I think for me, I didn't know all of this was going on. And I think it's really interesting that we can live in states and care about mutual flourishing for Israelis and Palestinians and not know about these laws that are being passed, because they do just kind of get slid under the radar. So I'd echo what David said, encourage you to check out what bills are on the books in your state. And if you feel so moved, if you're brave enough to reach out to your elected representatives and talk about your views on this issue, or talk about why you think they might be problematic, and to just be aware of what the specific context is in your state. Both of these websites do a good job of summarizing them in a way that's accessible. And yeah, both fascinating and horrifying. Sorry that my screen sharing didn't quite work out. You'll have to explore a little bit more on your own, but wanted to make sure you saw those as a resource as well for some further learning and specifics.
Sarah, do you want us to do kind of like I don't know, example of a state? Like if someone has a state, like a home state they want us to look up?
That would be awesome. Anyone want to volunteer your state?
I'd love Minnesota.
Let's go Minnesota.
All right, Minnesota, here we go. Let's see what we got. Share status, any, explore. Okay, so it looks like we have multiple bills in Minnesota, one related to environmental sustainability that's pending, introduced less than 2 months ago, John. And then one related to Palestinian rights passed in at least introduced in 2017 and passed. So this is, yeah, a pretty typical anti-BDS bill that has been passed, and even with low values for contracts compared to what we've seen in other states.
I was looking at New York too. I mean, that's where I live, and that's, that state commerce affects a lot of, well, all state commerce affects it, but it's such a big one for business. And I don't know, a lot of people don't realize, because people think that New York is such a liberal state, and Chuck Schumer is, a liberal Senate leader, but he's very, very pro-Israel and has a hand in passing these bills. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of New York Jews who are against what he's doing and protesting in front of his house, and and still and it looks like we've got some passed too here in New York as well.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Virginia, that this is happening in states that aren't just typically Democrat or typically Republican. And one of the important points, and we'll dive into this a little bit more in depth, throughout this conversation, is it's free speech that is important to everyone on the left and the right, and it's free speech that's being threatened by our elected representatives on the left and the right. So all of us, regardless of what our political affiliation is or what state we live in, have folks that we could reach out to who probably either don't know a ton about these bills and why they're a problem, or could, hear from folks and need to hear from folks who are a part of their, community, their in-group, their political alignment, saying, I'm concerned about this too. This isn't just, the other side. Just Vision in the film tended to have a slightly more progressive bent, but there are definitely issues that people who come from more conservative backgrounds would care about, where these types of bills and model legislation could be used to target that as well. David, any other examples you want to give, or shall we move on and encourage folks to dig around more on their own?
I think, go ahead, Susan.
Yeah.
There's like 7, 8 states there that were in the yellow, which meant pending. Is it make any difference if somebody from another state, like if I'm in Illinois, to reach out to those 7, 8 states? Or do you have to be a resident of that state?
I think it
I
never
think
hurts
in-
to reach out. I
Yeah.
don't know if they'll be as responsive, but if that's a good way to make your voice heard, it never hurts to say, you know, what you believe in and to encourage folks to take a more nuanced look.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea, but I know just from living in DC, like basically an office can't refuse to meet with you if you are a constituent of theirs. They have to respond to you in some way, even if it's like a form letter. But I don't think that there's the same kind of, you would be placed below the constituents in that state. So I would say if you know people who live in that state, that would probably be the more strategic way to do it. But like Sarah said, I think it's always good to make representatives aware of what they're voting on. I know in the film, there was that one Democrat state senator from Arkansas who was like, I didn't even know what this was, and I would have voted no if I'd known. So maybe he would be somebody that if somebody had just flagged this for him, regardless of where they lived, that might have made a difference. But
Yeah.
Sharon,
Sharon.
that's what prompted the question. That 30-second Arkansas Democrat.
yeah.
Susan, you may have cut out if you weren't finished.
Yeah, I think she's frozen for me.
Okay. Yeah, but it sounds like that the Democrat in the film prompted the question who didn't know enough about the bill before he just voted on it. And so, yeah, that's kind of what we want to touch on for the rest of this call as well, is some conversational talking points that we think are important and why we wanted to share this film with you all that might be helpful as you all move forward talking about this within your communities or choosing to do some advocacy work around this to elected state governments and representatives. I know for myself, it's hard to go to someone and just say like, this is a problem. And then they come back and say, okay, so why? And have a lot of questions. So hopefully this conversation today can help just dive into more of those things that you can say in response when people talk about this. Or just for our own understanding internally about why this is something that's problematic. I know the first time I saw the film, I had kind of that like visceral feelings reaction. And this has been a good way to put some words to those feelings about why this is just wrong. So David, I want to bring you in here, especially because you do a lot of work, you know, teaching and working on how to make some of these things that we care about more accessible to folks and public, and do a really good job of explaining things in a way that's really digestible and easy to share with other folks. So why is this legislation something that we should all care about as Americans, regardless of our views on Israel-Palestine and whether or not we even have a view on Israel-Palestine?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And, you know, I think when we think broadly about the importance of this issues, it's so deeply connected to our ability to care and speak honestly and tell the truth about any of the political beliefs that we hold, right? For the government to come in and coerce a position that we have or restrict our ability to do, you know, contracts, business with the state. I mean, even have jobs that we've had for many years, as the case of Bahia in the film, the teacher in the school in Texas. I think this sets a really dangerous precedent, not just for this issue, but for, you know, the broad spectrum of all the issues that we care about. And boycotts have actually been protected free speech in the United States for several decades. I mean, not only do we have this from the beginning with the First Amendment, right, our ability to speak freely about things that we care about, at least in the US, but since 1982, there was a Supreme Court case that said boycotts are actually protected forms of speech. They express a political belief or goal and aren't just economic activity. There's a really interesting, the story behind that case is really fascinating. We can talk about it a little bit more later when we talk about the history of boycotts used for political goals in the US. But this has been, you know, a core part of what it means to, or a core part of American ideals for centuries, right? The ability to believe what we believe and to practice that freely in the public square. So I think this is really important, and not only that, but as we're seeing, this is holding a threat to, or becoming a bill or a type of bill that is being used to restrict our ability to make political decisions about other issues, like, as the film mentioned, things like climate change and our beliefs about gun policies, right? And what's happening is not only are these bills being used as templates, but the bills that have already passed are being amended to also include these other issues. So it's not even a new bill entirely. It's the same the same law that's now being amended. So it's a really kind of behind the scenes, insidious way of restricting free speech across our country. I think this is something that Laura Friedman gets to really well in the film. And I think she represents an example of someone who not only cares about Israel-Palestine and is advocating within her community and without, but is also raising the flag about all of these other issues and the threats that this kind of legislation holds. And I will say there's an amazing resource that she updates regularly that shows the progression of all of these laws, especially as they're being used as models and templates for other issues. And I looked at it today, and she's already updated a new bill being passed in my home state, North Carolina, just 2 days ago, or at least being proposed 2 days ago, that's amending the anti-BDS legislation that has already passed to also include restricting government contracts to businesses and individuals who choose not to invest in fossil fuel-based companies. And this was 2 days ago. So again, if you're looking for updated resources, look to these folks. Laura Friedman, she's at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. You can find that resource. I think Sarah shared it on the Palestine Legal website. That's how I found it originally, I believe. But what's important to note is, I mean, for our work, especially as peacemakers who are trying to create a new movement, kind of a third way that's breaking out of these binaries of pro-Israel or pro-Palestine into something that's more expansive and that's for the people, right? Pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace is the tagline that we hold, is that this issue becomes such a domestic issue. It's right, this foreign policy issue that people care about that now becomes a matter of American politics, that even some of the state senators and representatives aren't even aware of what they're doing and the way that we're importing this conflict into our own politics. So I think it's important for us, just not only because this is a restriction and a threat to our free speech, but also our ability to care and advocate on other issues that we believe in. And as Sarah mentioned, this isn't just, you know, a left or a right attack or a right-leaning attack. These bills can be used by anyone, you know, depending on whoever's in power at that moment, to restrict our ability to care about whatever it is we believe in. So this isn't just a matter for, you know, progressives. It's also a matter for all of us together as we're trying to chart a future for every American in this nation. I will say most of these laws, just to talk a little bit about them as they're being passed, a lot of them, when they're being held up under court scrutiny, judicial review, they're not holding up. So when, you know, the NAACP has been a part of a lot of lawsuits against these laws, when they're going under review, most of them are not holding up. However, many of them are still on the books today. Why is that? Most of the states, as they're litigating these cases, are amending the laws to make the lawsuits moot. So if there's a case where a person is having their contract canceled because they choose not to sign a pledge to boycott Israel, what they will do is they will change the definition of law to expand, to increase the bar of a boycott. So instead of, you know, we saw in Minnesota, the bar was $1,000 or $5,000, I think is what it said. That's a pretty low bar for a contract. Say if you're, you know, a teacher, and hopefully you're making more than $1,000 or $5,000 a year, right? That's your year's salary. So what they're doing is they're raising the bar to, let's say, 100,000 or 500,000. So it makes these cases moot, and now the whole process has to start over to litigate these laws and prove their unconstitutionality. So that's happened already in Arizona, Georgia, Kansas, and Texas. And it's just one example of the ways these, you know, these communities, these state legislatures are finding really, you know, tricky and specific ways to keep these laws on the books.
Yeah, that's really helpful context, David. And what comes to mind as you're saying all of that is no one likes to feel like someone's pulled a fast one on you. And it's totally fine to disagree in the political arena, right? Like robust free speech is part of how we become a better country and pass policy that hopefully benefits us all. But no one likes feeling like someone's sneaking something in and sneaking something by them. And as you were talking, one of the stories I want to pull out from the film that I think really illustrates why this is something that's important, regardless of your stance on boycotts or Israel-Palestine, is the story of Rabbi Barry Block, who's the leader of the largest synagogue in Arkansas. And he says really clearly he does not support any kind of form of boycott of Israel that's, anathema to his own values. And yet he was horrified that a newspaper would have to pledge not to boycott Israel in order to get state funding, because what does that have to do with their reporting or their right of free speech? And I think that's something really important to remember here too, is that even if it feels like, those sneaky little pieces of legislation might benefit someone in the short run, anything that restricts our ability to actually be a robust democracy in the long run doesn't serve any of us, regardless of what our political interests are.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
The other thing that I think was really horrifying about that situation in the film was the government guy who made the bill or whatever, and didn't even talk to the rabbi or anything, and sort of dismissed him when he was even brought up. It's like, I mean, talk about anti-Semitism, right? And it was like manipulating it, totally not including a person who this is like a part of their identity. And that to me was so gross and revealing about these people's motivation, and that on top of the way that they use that term to justify what they're doing, and yet they are practicing anti-Semitism. I was so upset by that scene, but it was really revealing. It was very important to see.
I think that's one of the things that's most insidious about these laws, is that if you look at the state senator Hester, he clearly, I'm assuming that this Jewish rabbi lives in his constituency, or at least some of the congregants of his congregation live in his community. Clearly that representative is not listening to that community. And so what is the recourse that we have against, other than voting, which is obviously a very good way to make our voices heard, but the other thing that we have is our economic power. And if our representatives are not going to represent us in the way that we find palatable or that we agree with, and they're not even willing to listen to us, how else can we exert power over the state? And I think that boycott has been upheld by the Supreme Court as one of those ways that we can. And we've seen that happen over and over again in US history. And so taking that away and introducing the idea that anything that this guy thinks is like part of his moral obligation to do as an evangelical Christian man in this position, he's going to do it. And he can restrict people's ability to act and speak on this in all ways, through their voting if he stays in office, and through their wallets.
And it brings us to another element of this whole thing, which is the Christian nationalism, and these people who are doing this stuff in a theocratical way, that's not even a word, but, like instead of a real democratic way, and in an anti-Semitic way. And I just thought, God, he's doing all this stuff in the name of evangelicalism and talking about why these are passing, because there's all these evangelicals who believe this in the government or whatever, not even acknowledging the rabbi and it was so offensive. It was basically, he's dominating Judaism and using Judaism to support his own, not even Christian theologically, but Christian nationalism. Oh God, it was just, but that speaks to so much of the, what's happening. And it's just another aspect that was in the film, but wasn't really in the film, but it was like, whoa.
Virginia, it's like you've read my outline for today.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we'll jump around a little bit, because I don't want to switch us away from this topic and then have to come back later. So we'll flip some stuff around, because this is a really important point to tease out. And where we're going to go next is talk a little bit about anti-Semitism, and we'll go back to talking about anti-Semitism the way it might be most recognizable. But what you just laid out and described is what we would call philo-Semitism at Telos, which we've talked about it a little bit before in this community, but it's also kind of a hard concept to unpack, because it feels like it's the opposite of what you would think it would be. So philo-Semitism is the objectification of Jews or the Jewish people by exceptionalizing them or expressing excessive interest in or support for Jewish people simply because they're Jewish. On the surface, it might not like seem problematic because it's rooted in positive feelings, but it takes away Jewish diversity and agency and flattens a whole community into one object that can then be used the way you just described as like a thing or something that can be written off, or right. It's not that he didn't, or I think his name is Bart Hester. It's not that that senator didn't just talk to one rabbi. He didn't talk to any of the Jewish community in Arkansas. And I'm sure there are folks who might support his views. And so the fact that he felt like he knew better what would quote unquote serve the Jewish people by supporting Israel, like that is the type of anti-Semitism that we would call philo-Semitism. And Sharon, you've spent a lot of time as we were creating our FAQs. I'll drop those in the chats as well if you want to spend more time reading about Christian Zionism and how it relates to Israel Palestine as well. Sharon, I want to bring you in to talk a little bit more about the senator whose name is Bart Hester. He's the self-identified Republican evangelical Arkansas state senator. Virginia just did a great job like teasing out some of those themes, but can you state them a little bit more like explicitly about why he exemplifies that philo-Semitic Christian Zionist view?
Sure. And Virginia, you did a great job of introducing this. Thank you. So I might repeat a little bit of what you just said, but I think Hester starts with this idea that he is called as a Christian to support the Jewish people and to use his power to support and protect them, is the words that he used. But as you listen to him throughout the rest of the film, as Virginia was saying, it becomes really clear he's created his own definition about what a Jewish community is and what parts of the Jewish community count towards that call to protect. And he's basically conflating all Jewish people worldwide with the interests of the current government of Israel. And you see that as he's totally ignored this rabbi, as we were talking about. And he basically says that the local Jewish leaders here in Little Rock, I don't agree with them on anything, so I don't listen to them. And I don't listen to them on these things. And that we're a representative democracy. And while he should not be listening only to the Jewish community, those constituents who are in his constituency should be heard. But because he has this definition that he's imposed upon what being Jewish means, he's only listening to this one voice, which is basically the Netanyahu's government's voice in this. And we see this on a larger scale in Christian Zionism and Christian Zionist organizations like Pastor John Hagee. Christians United for Israel is pretty prominently featured in the film. And their support for Israel is for Israel, again, as the modern political body. And anyone who doesn't support that body in the way that Kufi, Christians United for Israel, would define it, so an uncritical promotion and support of the Israeli government's agenda, is against God. So they've conflated this with a religious value. And as a Christian, if you are opposing the Israeli government, or even if you're advocating for different policies or against the things like the Judicial Reform Act that the government's trying to pass right now, that's very problematic, you're going against your faith and against your religion. And so that includes even other Christians or Jewish people. If they're supporting Israel in a way that Kufi doesn't agree with, they're going against God. And so this is So philo-Semitism, just kind of sum up, erases anyone who doesn't fit into the given perspective, and at best ignores the diversity of opinion within the worldwide Jewish community. And at least in the case of the way that Hagee and Hester define Christian Zionism, it uses Jewish people as a means to an end. It's not even really, if you dig deep down into it, you're using Jewish people because you believe that if you bless Jewish people, you will be blessed. So you're using them to access a blessing from God, and so that you can be raptured into heaven at the end times. And so this is completely at odds. I'm sure this is obvious to anyone that's read our Principles and Practices of Peacemaking, because you're not listening to understand the diversity and breadth of opinion within a community. You're cherry picking and then using people as a means to your own end.
And I would also add too, one of the core practices of peacemaking is center the leadership of the marginalized, right? So if we're going to support and advocate on behalf of a community that we see as targeted, that we see as marginalized, but we're not actually letting them lead, we are often opening ourselves up to doing more harm than good, right? And I think that's quite obvious in this case. So I think that's also an important practice to commit to in this work as well.
One other practice, and this is why I think it's so important to focus on this, especially for some of our communities, is self-interrogation. I think a lot of us belong to communities where, I mean, I'd say all of us belong to communities where anti-Semitism comes up, whether we know it does or not. And for those of us who belong to historically Christian communities or communities that might come from backgrounds that have some of these views that are embedded in our theology, whether we want them to be or not, it's an opportunity for us to bring some of this learning to those communities and to our friends and families and churches, and to say, like, what does it really love the Jewish people in all their complexity, to do what David was saying of center the leadership of the marginalized, to listen, to understand, to hold those perspectives for what they are, not just for what we think they should be for us. And we'll touch on that a little bit more later, but just want to flag that of why this is an aspect of anti-Semitism that we keep coming back to, is it's one where we really have an opportunity to make a difference as well.
I think that movie, I can't remember the title of it, the movie that focused on the International Federation of Christians and Jews, whatever that movie was with the Ecksteins and
Still
that
Kingdom
Tennessee
Come.
pastor, sorry?
Still Kingdom,
Kingdom Come.
Yeah.
Really exposed this quote Philo, which is not really Philo Semitism at all. It is not, it's like using Jewish people because Christians think Jesus will come back sooner. Like, it's really ugly. And I thought that movie did a great job of kind of showing that underbelly.
Yeah, it's a great film if you haven't had a chance to see it yet. I'm gonna have us, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying the whole thing about the mutual flourishing. I think when people are doing this God on my side theology, which, you know, you find that in every situation, from, you know, civil rights or slavery. You know, the whole South Africa, I was just there recently and seeing the whole apartheid theology. I mean, actually, you just can't even believe that that's a whole theology of, you know, the blacks being at one level, the coloreds at another level, the white at another level, that are only in the teens percentage, and how it just seems so like me-centered, selfish. You know, it's all about me thriving because God's on my side, but there's nothing to do with this mutual flourishing side of things that should trump everything, like, at least according to what I understand. But I think I've gotten more and more frustrated with how the Bible through history has been used in that way of putting one group of people over the other. And like, I'm getting so irritated with being a part of it. And I just think our ancestors, you know, the people, I should say, the people that come are going to look back at us in the same way that we looked at where were the whites standing up for the blacks, you know, during civil rights and during, I don't know. It's just, I don't know. I'm getting fed up with it all. So thank you for letting me express myself.
I hear you, Beth. That it's a definite tension, right? We belong to long histories, but we also have the opportunity to say, you know, that's the history that I come from, and also here's how I want to make a change moving forward. Here's this is how I want to live out my values. And I think there's a lot of power in that, and acknowledging and dealing with the history. And then, you know, we use this word more for our US program, but restoring where we want to move forward. It's not about ignoring that long history that we really wish had been different, but saying, what am I going to take from that and build something better that really centers that idea of mutual flourishing.
Yeah. And how can we get others to like self-interrogate with us? Because all of us have come along and all of us have been the ignorant, you know, I mean, through my life. And I'm loving, you know, discovering just being disillusioned. I heard a quote recently that said, I'd rather be disillusioned, you know, about these new things that I'm learning than live in an illusion. And I love that. I'm done with living in illusion, because I think all these theologies are illusions. And the other word they use, they're addictions. Addictions harm people, and without knowing it. And so I see that happening so much in these theologies, that they're so harmful. And until we self-interrogate, we're not going to see how we've harmed.
Exactly.
Beth, that's such a good word. And I've been thinking a lot about this recently as well. Like what does it take to invite people and to give them the courage to do that work, because it's hard work and it's lifelong work, right? And I was thinking about this recently as I was having the conversation with Andrew DeCourt that we recorded for our podcast, the check-in, about his new book, Flourishing on the Edge of Faith. And I know you know Andrew and support his work. And I think his answer to this question that I posed of like, what does it take to have moral courage to do that work, to self-interrogate, to challenge your community, to move to a place of being free of those addictions to power and prestige and status, right? Which lead us into violence and depression and marginalizing others. And I felt like his answer, at least for faith communities, was so powerful for me. Basically, he said, starting at the beginning of the Lord's Prayer, our Father, or our Holy Parent, and recognizing the belovedness that each of us has is the sense of security we need to do that work. That's hard. That challenges our identity. That challenges the places that we believe we come from. And that may not resonate with everyone, but I wanted to flag that, Beth, knowing that Andrew, and point people to that podcast episode and his book as well, which I find just such an amazing resource for finding the internal courage and sense of security and self-assuredness to be able to do that work over a lifetime.
I'm glad you bring up courage, DCAT. Virginia, go ahead. And then I want us to not move on, but bring in a couple other points. But I'm loving the discussion, so go ahead.
No, I just love what you said, Beth. And I just wanted to encourage you to, like, that anger that you're feeling, like a way that that is a gift too, but because it points to something. And one way that I think is, for me personally, that's like kind of transforms it into a way of restoration is, you look at, so there's basically what you're talking about is exclusivism. So exclusive theology, which all religions have their version. And then, all religions also have their inclusive versions or their pluralistic versions or, whatever. And a lot of what I've found so cool is using this as an opportunity to, this kind of like bristle and like sadness and grief really at exclusivism and how it harms people, finding people even in other faiths who also have that grief about exclusivism and using that as a way to connect across lines of difference, right? And because I think it is a shared grief that all of us have in all of our faiths, not everyone, because obviously there's practitioners, but turning that into a way to connect across lines of difference, I think has been a really cathartic way to process that grief and turn it into some, an action that's helpful.
Thanks, Virginia. Yvonne Holden, who's our director of Restore US program, says repeatedly, you have to have your heart broken in order to do this work. And I really wish that wasn't true. Like, the heartbreak can be overwhelming. I think, especially with some of the film resources we have coming up or other topics, like this is really heavy work. But it's in that place of heartbreak that we start to see all of the work ahead of us that needs to be done. I want to pick back up on what David was saying about courage, and this is going to be a hard transition, so bear with me. But if you remember in the first Harry Potter, when Neville Longbottom stands up to Harry, Ron, and Hermione, and Dumbledore says it's hard to stand up to your enemies, but it's even harder to stand up to your friends. This is my way of pulling us back around and saying we all belong to communities that have to do this self-interrogation work around how we show up and how we show up both in love and in harm. And so I want to bring in kind of, we talked about philo-Semitism and maybe the Christian Zionist view that might tend to be a little bit more conservative or from the right. I want to talk about some of this also that tends to be a little bit more from the left, not to say like left is right, right is left, left is correct, too many lefts and rights. Moving on past this transition, I lost my own train of thought there. But I want to circle back around to listening to understand what the BDS movement is, because that's something that comes up a lot, I think, in discussions about this anti-boycott legislation. And I know when I've talked to friends and family about this, they kind of come back and say, well, what do you think about BDS? But like, is BDS good or bad? Like, they focus on that idea of, is boycotting Israel right or wrong, rather than some of these questions about First Amendment freedoms to really speak up for what we do want to be promoting. So in the spirit of listening to understand what the BDS movement is and holding it in its complexity, David, I know we're running a little bit short on time, but I want to bring you back in here to help us just understand a little bit about what the BDS movement is, so that if we find ourselves with that moment of having to like know what it is when we're engaging with other folks, we'll be able to do that in a way that we feel confident that we aren't starting from something that we can't understand or defend.
Yeah, absolutely, Sarah. Yeah, I think it's so important to at least know how this movement got started, what are its goals, and even how do people respond to it. So just to start, Beth, you brought up South Africa. It's the BDS movement is based off of an international movement to help end apartheid in South Africa, and to extend that justice work for human rights for Palestinians in the case of Israel and Palestine. So it started in 2005, this movement, in response, and as a nonviolent response to Israeli oppression and attacks on human rights of Palestinians, particularly during the Second Intifada, which was a very violent period here in Israel and Palestine. And it's meant to create international pressure on Israel to end its policies against the Palestinians by doing three things. One, boycotting Israeli goods and services and culture even. So that includes educational boycotts. There are professors who choose not to come here to lecture, to have professorships in Israeli universities and so on. Divestment from Israeli companies, both public and private. There are some forms of BDS that also restrict that to, or both, all of this just to Israeli companies in the West Bank and the illegal Israeli settlements there. And then also 3 economic sanctions against the Israeli government and Israeli companies. So that's what it's doing, but what it's trying to accomplish is 3 things according to, and this is from the movement's goals. And again, regardless of how you land on these positions, it's important to understand what they are and why they're doing this work. 3 things. 1, ending the occupation and colonization of Arab lands, and particularly dismantling the West Bank separation barrier or apartheid wall, as this movement calls it. 2, recognizing the fundamental rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel, which are often not provided the same protection under the law and given the same access to resources within Israel proper. So these are Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. 3, it's respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. So this right of return, as it's understood within the Palestinian context, would offer the ability for Palestinian refugees and their descendants, which now number in the several million, to return to the land, to the places where they were removed, fled, kicked out, pushed out in 1948. So those are its 3 goals. And just to circle back to our earlier conversation, this is a Palestinian-led movement. So when we talk about centering the leadership of the marginalized, it's important to at least recognize that, listen to this community as in a posture of understanding and learning, and also to recognize that there are different ways to resist injustice through nonviolence, right? So I think nonviolence is a core part of how we understand peacemaking, right? Because it upholds the dignity of all people. And yes, there are situations and there are people who may support BDS who may hold anti-Semitic views or do it in anti-Semitic ways. But I think it's important to recognize that wherever nonviolence is being used in creative ways, that can be an expression of peacemaking. So again, we're not necessarily telling you, you must support BDS, you may not. But I think it's important, as Sarah was mentioning, to at least understand where it's coming from, to recognize the movements that's supporting it and defining it, and to look for ways in broader society that we can creatively use nonviolent resistance.
Thanks for that, DCAT. I know we're running a little bit short on time, and I don't want to like run through what we had to get through the rest of this because I think it's important, but might move a little bit faster just because I want us to tie all the pieces together. So DCAT, you mentioned, or David, sorry, you mentioned that there are some actors within BDS that definitely do use it as a vehicle to espouse some anti-Semitic views. There are others who absolutely don't. And just writing off BDS as an anti-Semitic movement isn't helpful in having any kind of nuanced conversation about advocating for Palestinian human rights at the same time as combating anti-Semitism. Can you give us the quick outline overview, unpacking some of the nuance around BDS and anti-Semitism and why that's important to understand for us who aren't, engaging with the BDS movement directly? Tell us doesn't take a position, but why is it important to understand that nuance even though we don't do that?
Yes, and I'll try to be quick and concise about it. For many folks in the Jewish community, when they hear about BDS, they're reminded of the anti-Semitic boycotts in the history of our world, particularly in Europe during the Nazi regime, right? So there's a history of oppression and marginalization that's there that we recognize and need to acknowledge as well. Secondly, there's a really core question that's inherent in BDS's goals that challenges kind of a Zionist understanding of Israel, that it's both Jewish and democratic, right? When you have millions of refugees who are Palestinian coming to the land, that changes who's here, right? And who gets to call this place home. And so that for many people can be, all right, well, is this going to be Israel as I understood it anymore if BDS, if its goals are accomplished? So I think that's important to understand where that challenge is coming from, where it's located.
Sorry, I thought you were going to keep going. That was perfect. Thank you. I think part of why I wanted to tease that piece out, even though we're running short on time, is anytime we're doing engagement where this question of anti-Semitism comes up, is the same action, can be seen as anti-Semitic by some and not by others. And Virginia had mentioned that question of what's this legislation around anti-Semitism earlier when we were looking at the state map. I'll share a link in the chat, and then also in the follow-up email, the link to the Jerusalem definition of anti-Semitism, the Jerusalem Declaration definition. So rather than, writing all critique of Israel off as anti-Semitic, it's really important to distinguish between criticism of Israel that is rooted in, human rights and foreign policy and is moving us towards mutual flourishing, what we were discussing earlier, and critique that does sometimes cross the line into anti-Semitism. So how can we practice resisting anti-Semitism even as we critique Israeli policies? We've touched on some of this, but I want to highlight it again because this is really important to our work throughout this. It's engaging with the history of anti-Semitism in our own communities, whether we're Christians or not, right? All of us come from communities where that's an opportunity to self-interrogate, to reject and call out anti-Semitic tropes wherever they arise, to avoid language or actions that instrumentalize a people for the political aim of any kind, and to differentiate between individuals and communities and political leaders and governments to essentially refuse to essentialize an entire people into one aspect of their identity. So with all of this, it's really important to make that distinction between, when we talk about the right to boycott, are we boycotting a policy or a people? It's always legitimate to boycott policies that are against human rights and that we disagree with. It's very, very, very rarely okay to boycott people based on who they are. So Sharon, I know we've got 2 minutes left, but I want to tie this into American history because we've talked about why this is also just a deeply American issue, even if you aren't tied to Israel-Palestine or care about Israel-Palestine. And if you need to go 2 or 3 minutes over, I think that's okay. Feel free to hop off if you all need to leave. But I want to tie this back into, who we are and why this is a deeply American issue and why nonviolent resistance and boycotts have been so essential to our own American story.
Sure. So this will be review for probably most of you, but boycotts are baked into American history since the beginning depending on when you count the beginning. But in the American Revolution, colonists were boycotting things because they were protesting tax policy in England. And the whole point of that was to raise the cost of England acting in this way and to pass that cost along, not just to the government, but to the people and the merchants that they were refusing to buy from. And that cost, along with lots of other things, is one of the reasons why this country exists as it does today. You can look at the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and 1956 as another example, this 13-month-long boycott of public buses and thousands of people walking tens of thousands of miles cumulatively to go to work, boycotting and passing costs, making it costly for the government to enforce this policy that they disagreed with. In both of those cases, you see outcomes, while not perfect, that made progress towards what each of those populations were advocating towards. And I'll close with just this. I was really struck by something that the Arkansas Times editor, Alan Leverett, said about how he believes things should be, that you do, quote, you do a job, you get business based on merit, and you get paid for it. You don't have to pass some political litmus test. And then he says, this is America. And we can debate whether that's actually a true characterization of America or whether that's equally true for all people. I would argue that it's not. But I think that this is part of the collective mythology around the American dream. And it's something that I think we can aspire to while recognizing the failures of the past and the present. And when it comes down to it, this is what we want. And boycotts in the ways that Sarah was talking about, boycotting policies that we disagree with, being able to not just use our voices literally, but use our voices in other ways, voting with your feet, like going to different stores, or voting with your wallet and how you pay for things and what you decide to buy. And so I think when it comes down to it, it doesn't sound like an American ideal that my job could be contingent on whether I use my privately held finances and time to advocate for something that my elected representative has decided to pass a law against. And that's kind of where this boils down to. And which is one of the reasons that we think that there's a lot of movement potential around this, not to jump into kind of the next steps. But I think you don't have to have an opinion on boycotting Israel to be very concerned about this. I think one of the things that might be helpful when you're talking to people who don't really see why this could be a big issue is to ask them what are things that they hold very close in terms of their values and morals. Like I know my family, lots of my family are very traditionally pro-life. And if there were, and I also have friends who are traditionally pro-choice. And one thing that I was talking to my family about is if there were like pro-abortion rights groups in power, they could restrict my family's ability to boycott economically organizations like Planned Parenthood. And while we might disagree on what those rights should be and what reproductive rights should be, I think that they should have the right to do with their money what they want based on their values. So I think that could just be an interesting exercise to ask people to do, is to just sit down with and identify things that you believe strongly about and want to act in accordance with those beliefs, and think about what would happen and how you would feel if your ability to act in those ways was taken away by the government.
Thanks for landing us there, Sharon. That was great. To wrap up very quickly, kind of in summary, again, why we wanted to have this conversation is this is an issue that's really important, as Sharon just said, I think for all of us, regardless of whether we're just thinking about advocating for mutual flourishing in Israel-Palestine or any of the other issues we care about in the US, even if we don't all agree on what those issues are. So as we engage this is a really great opportunity to invite your own communities to listen, to understand, and hold perspectives in tension. I think Boycott's a great film to share with, friends and family, to have a discussion about as you dive through the legislation tracker from Just Vision and Legal Palestine, or Palestine Legal. They've got some great resources for how to open this conversation with those folks. And again, as we were talking about, right, open that conversation about interrogating anti-Semitism and trying to, self-interrogate for ourselves where our own blind spots are, or where those in our communities are, and to bring that into this conversation as well. It's not we're advocating for human rights or we're combating anti-Semitism. It's always got to happen at the same time. And again, just at the end of the day, protecting American First Amendment rights and values so we can all continue advocating for what we believe in Israel, Palestine, and not. And just going to end with a final plug to check out that legislation tracker from Just Vision. Wish I could have had my screen share going. Thanks again, David, for jumping in with that save there. But there's a lot of really interesting information. I'd encourage you to poke around a little bit and become more informed, because as we've talked about, it's clear that the folks who are pushing this legislation through don't really want us to be informed. I'm happy to stay on for another 5-10 minutes if folks want to share final thoughts, but I'm also going to say we can end the recording. So thanks for joining us. If you need to jump, feel free to jump, and I can stay in chat if other folks have burning thoughts they want to wrap us up with. But thanks for joining us for another great session.